My dad dragged me on the gravel by my hair for denting my sister's car. Then he locked me in the kennel. Mutts belong outside. Dad laughed. They'd regret what came next. If you ever drove past our house on Birchwood Drive, you would see the kind of home that belongs on the cover of a glossy lifestyle magazine. The lawn was always a vibrant, aggressive shade of green, manicured so precisely it looked like a synthetic carpet. The white shutters were absolutely spotless, the wraparound porch looked incredibly welcoming, and the massive oak tree in the front yard anchored the entire picture in a sense of established, wealthy permanence. But that house was a lie. It was nothing more than a carefully constructed stage set, and my parents, Victor and Helena, were the obsessive directors of a play where I was never meant to be seen. My name is Rowan. At the time everything fell apart, I was 25 years old, a recent graduate with a degree in biochemistry, and completely, hopelessly stuck. I had no money, no job offers despite sending out hundreds of applications, and I was living in the basement of that picture-perfect house. But living is probably the wrong word. I was simply existing in the margins. You see, in the field of psychology, there is a very specific dynamic that occurs in toxic families. They have a golden child, the one who can do no wrong, the one who reflects the parents' idealized version of themselves. And then, there is the scapegoat. The invisible vessel where the family dumps all their insecurities, their anger, and their failures. In my family, the sun rose and set on my younger sister, Sienna. She was 20 years old at the time, and she was the undisputed center of the universe. Sienna was undeniably beautiful, effortlessly charming, and fiercely ambitious in all the ways my parents valued. She cared about aesthetics, social climbing, and status. I, on the other hand, was quiet, awkward, and buried in science textbooks. My parents did not know what to do with a daughter who preferred the solitude of a laboratory over a country club gala. So, they decided to simply ignore my existence, unless they needed someone to blame. To survive in that house, I had learned to shrink myself. I became a master of walking softly, of speaking only when spoken to, of ensuring my belongings never cluttered the common areas. If Sienna left her designer shoes in the middle of the hallway, it was a sign of her busy, vibrant life. If I left a single pen on the kitchen counter, it was a severe character flaw, an insult to my mother's pristine environment. I was an intruder in my own home, a shadowy figure haunting the basement, constantly trying to prove my worth to two people who had already decided I had none. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that as soon as I landed an entry-level research role, I would pack my bags, move into a tiny apartment, and finally breathe. But the weight of their constant disapproval was heavy, pressing down on my chest every single day, making it incredibly hard to find the energy to even look for an escape. It was not always this bad. When I search my earliest memories, I can find fleeting moments of normalcy. Victor used to take me to the park. Helena used to ask about my day. But everything shifted precisely when Sienna turned 15. That was the year she blossomed, the year she realized the power of her appearance, and the year my parents realized she could be their ultimate trophy. The shift was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, creeping rot that eroded my place in the family until there was nothing left but dust. The favoritism started with small, dismissive gestures and grew into a canyon of neglect. I remember my sophomore year of college clearly. I was killing myself taking advanced organic chemistry while working two separate, grueling jobs as a lab assistant. I worked late into the night, washing beakers and organizing samples until my hands were cracked and bleeding. I did this because Victor had sat me down and demanded I pay rent to live at home during the semesters. He told me it was about building character, about learning the harsh realities of the world. He said nothing in life was free. So, I handed over nearly every dollar I earned, hundreds of dollars a month, feeling a misguided sense of pride that I was contributing, that I was earning my keep and perhaps earning their respect. Then, summer arrived. I came home from a 12-hour shift, utterly exhausted, and walked into the kitchen to find Helena and Sienna giggling over an iPad. They were booking a luxury vacation to Cabo San Lucas for Sienna and 3 of her friends to celebrate her completing her freshman year of college, a year where she barely maintained a passing grade. I stood there, smelling like chemicals and cheap coffee, and listened as Victor walked in and proudly announced he was covering the entire trip. When I later looked at the bank statements left carelessly on the home office desk, I saw the truth. The exact amount he had squeezed out of me for rent over the past 9 months was the exact amount he just wired to a luxury resort in Mexico. My blood, my sweat, my exhaustion, it was all just currency used to fund my sister's vanity. When I confronted them about it, crying out of pure betrayal, Victor did not apologize. He looked at me with cold, dead eyes and said that Sienna was building a network, that she needed to maintain a certain image for her future, while my little science experiments were going nowhere. Helena simply sipped her wine and told me to stop being so terribly dramatic and jealous. That was the day I realized their love was not unconditional. It was transactional, and I had absolutely zero value in their market. Yet, I stayed. It is a pathetic truth to admit, but the trauma response of a scapegoat is often to fawn, to try even harder to please the abusers, hoping that maybe, just maybe, if I achieved enough, they would finally look at me the way they looked at her. The week leading up to the incident was thick with a suffocating, unbearable tension. The air in the house felt like it was made of lead. Sienna was preparing for a massive charity gala, an event she claimed would launch her career as a lifestyle influencer. The house was constantly filled with tailors, makeup artists, and event planners. Helena was in a state of manic perfectionism, barking orders at everyone, while Victor paced the floors, writing checks and beaming with arrogant pride. I, meanwhile, was experiencing my own silent crisis. I had just received my 20th rejection email for a research position. My bank account held exactly $93. I was trapped, a ghost haunting the edges of their chaotic celebration. I spent my days confined to the basement, trying to stay out of the way, only venturing upstairs to grab a glass of water or a quick meal when the kitchen was empty. I was walking on eggshells, constantly hyper-aware of their moods, analyzing the heavy footsteps on the floorboards above me to gauge if it was safe to emerge. Every interaction was a landmine. If I accidentally made eye contact with Helena, she would sigh loudly and mutter about how my gloomy presence was dragging down the energy of the house. If Victor saw me sitting with my laptop, he would sneer and ask if I was ever going to stop pretending to work and get a real job flipping burgers. The psychological toll was immense. I was losing my grip on reality, starting to believe their narrative that I was truly a burden, a useless leech clinging to their perfect life. I felt utterly paralyzed, unable to fight back, unable to leave. The pressure was building inside me, a quiet, boiling rage that I suppressed so deeply it manifested as physical pain in my stomach and a constant, ringing headache. I did not know it then, but the powder keg was completely full. All it needed was a single, microscopic spark. The morning it happened, the sun was already beating down with an oppressive, suffocating heat. The air was entirely still, heavy with humidity. I had an online interview scheduled for a low-paying data entry job, anything to get me out of that house. I realized I had left a crucial reference notebook out on the front porch chair the night before. I hurried upstairs, practically holding my breath so I wouldn't disturb the sacred silence of the house. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out onto the gravel driveway. Sienna's brand new, blindingly white luxury sedan was parked haphazardly, taking up entirely too much space. The gap between her car and the thick brick pillar of the porch was incredibly narrow. I squeezed myself tightly against the brick, holding my breath, trying to slip past. I had my heavy canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. As I slid past the rear of her car, the metal buckle of my backpack strap lightly brushed against the bumper. It made a tiny, dull scraping sound. Barely a whisper. I froze. I looked down. There, on the pristine white paint, was a faint, shallow scratch no longer than an inch. My heart dropped into my stomach. Before I could even process the panic, the front door ripped open. Sienna stood there, already fully dressed in designer clothes, a cup of expensive coffee in her hand. Her eyes darted from me to the bumper. She did not ask what happened. She did not inspect the damage. She simply opened her mouth and let out a calculated, ear-piercing, hysterical scream. Dad! Dad! She ruined it. She purposely ruined my car. Within seconds, the heavy thud of Victor's footsteps shook the porch. He burst out of the door, his face instantly twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not look at the car. He looked directly at me. I raised my hands, my voice trembling, trying to explain that it was an accident, that I would buy a touch-up pen, that I would fix it. He did not hear a single word. He lunged off the porch. His large, heavy hand shot out and twisted directly into my hair, grabbing a thick handful at the root. I screamed as the sudden, violent force yanked my head back. I lost my footing and fell hard onto the driveway. The sharp, jagged gravel bit deeply into my bare knees and the palms of my hands, instantly drawing blood. But Victor did not stop. He began to drag me. He pulled me backward across the rough stones, my body scraping against the harsh ground. The pain was searing, white-hot, and blinding. I kicked, I thrashed, I begged him to let go. I looked up towards the porch, desperate for help. Helena was standing there. She had a tall glass of iced tea in her hand. She was leaning against the wooden railing, her legs casually crossed, watching me get dragged across the dirt with a look of mild, bored irritation. She took a slow sip of her drink and looked away. Victor dragged me for what felt like miles, but was only about 30 feet, pulling me away from the front yard and aggressively hauling me toward the side gate that led to the backyard. I was sobbing now, a pathetic, gasping sound, my hands desperately trying to pry his thick fingers out of my hair. He kicked the wooden gate open with his boot and hauled me into the suffocating heat of the enclosed yard. In the far corner, half hidden by overgrown weeds, sat a rusted, heavy iron dog kennel. It was a leftover relic from a large mastiff my father had owned over a decade ago. It was filthy, covered in cobwebs, and the thick iron bars were hot to the touch from baking in the summer sun. Victor did not throw me out onto the street. He did not throw me into a trash can. He aimed directly for that cage. He unlatched the heavy metal door with one hand while keeping a brutal grip on my hair with the other. With a final, violent heave, he threw me inside. I crashed onto the hard, rusted metal floor, my head smacking against the iron bars. Before I could even orient myself, the heavy door slammed shut behind me. I heard the thick metal latch drop into place, followed by the definitive click of a padlock. I scrambled to my hands and knees, my skin burning from the cuts, and grabbed the hot iron bars. "Let me out. Please let me out," I screamed, the panic rising in my throat like bile. Victor stood towering over the cage, his chest heaving, a look of utter disgust painting his face. He leaned down slightly, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "You want to act like a wild, destructive animal? Then you get treated like one. Mutts belong outside." He turned on his heel and walked away. I heard footsteps approaching and saw Sienna. She wasn't angry anymore. She was holding her phone up, the red recording light blinking. A bright, mocking smile stretched across her face. She giggled, a sharp, cruel sound that pierced right through my eardrums. She filmed me kneeling in the dirt and rust, blood trickling down my shins. Then, she too turned and walked back inside, the back door clicking firmly shut behind her. I was left alone. The heat inside the metal box was rapidly becoming unbearable. The smell of old rust and damp earth filled my nose. I sat there for hours. The physical pain in my knees and scalp dulled, replaced by a psychological break so profound it felt like my soul was being ripped from my body. I realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that they did not view me as a human being. I was not a daughter. I was not even a person. I was an object of contempt, an insect they could trap and torture simply because I was an inconvenience. As the sun beat down on me, drying the tears on my dirty face, something inside me completely snapped. The desperate, fawning girl who just wanted her parents to love her finally died inside that cage. She was replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. I don't know exactly how long I was locked in there. It was late afternoon when the back door finally opened. Victor marched out, unlocked the padlock without making eye contact, and walked away. The door swung open with a pathetic squeak. I crawled out slowly, my muscles stiff and cramping. I did not speak. I did not go to the kitchen to clean my wounds. I walked silently down the stairs to the dark, cool basement, curled up on my small bed, and stared blankly at the concrete wall. I was waiting for the final blow, waiting for them to come down and finish the argument. But no one came. I fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, the thin sliver of light from the basement window told me it was morning. A strange, heavy silence hung over the house. Usually, I could hear the muffled sounds of Helena's morning shows or Victor's heavy footsteps. Today, there was absolutely nothing. I carefully climbed the stairs. The kitchen was impeccably clean. The living room was empty. I walked down the hall to my parents' bedroom. Empty. I walked to Sienna's room. Empty. My heart began to pound a slow, dreadful rhythm. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, which had been with me through the entire ordeal. The screen lit up with 2 notifications. The first was a text message from Sienna. It was a photo of the long, open highway taken from the passenger seat of a car. Underneath the photo, she had typed, "Oops. We took a detour. Hope you enjoy the peace and quiet. Try not to ruin the house while we are gone." The second notification was a voicemail from Victor. I pressed play, my hands shaking slightly. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, like he was reading a grocery list. We packed up the basement. His voice crackled through the speaker. "Your clothes, your computer, all those useless papers you waste your time on. We dropped it all off at the Ashland 91st Street shelter. Best start learning how the real world works. Let's see how you survive when you can't leech off us anymore. Do not call us." The line went dead. I stood completely frozen in the hallway. I turned around and ran back down the stairs to the basement. It was true. The room was stripped bare. My worn-out suitcase, my laptop containing years of research notes, my driver's license, my social security card, my meager winter coats, everything was gone. They had literally erased my existence from the house. They left me there with $93 in my bank account, the bloody, dirty clothes on my back, and absolutely nothing else. They had thrown me to the wolves, fully expecting me to be devoured. If you're outraged by how this family treated Rowan, help her get justice by liking this video, subscribing to the channel to follow her entire revenge journey, and don't forget to leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you so much. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and curse the sky. The moment the line went dead, a profound, absolute numbness washed over me, freezing my blood and hollowing out my chest. I walked out the front door, leaving it wide open behind me, and stepped onto the concrete. I was barefoot. My clothes were stained with dried blood from the gravel and dirt from the iron kennel. My hair was a tangled, matted mess. I walked straight down the driveway, the same driveway where I had been dragged like a garbage bag just 24 hours earlier, and headed toward the house next door. I did not look back at the pristine white shutters or the perfectly manicured lawn. That house was a tomb, and I was finally a ghost who had escaped it. I knocked on the heavy oak door of Mrs. Higgins. She was an elderly widow who had lived in the neighborhood since before I was born. She was sharp, observant, and did not care for the country club gossip that my mother thrived on. When she opened the door, her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, taking in my bruised knees, the dirt smeared across my face, and the hollow, dead look in my eyes. But she did not gasp. She did not coddle me or ask a dozen frantic questions. She simply stepped aside and told me to come into the kitchen. I sat at her small, round dining table. I did not cry. I just told her the truth. I told her about the scratch on the bumper, the dog kennel, the text message, and the voicemail. I told her they had dumped my entire life at a homeless shelter and driven off to take a vacation. Mrs. Higgins poured a cup of black coffee and set it in front of me. She sat down, her face entirely unreadable, and folded her hands. She told me she had always known Victor was a cruel man, and Helena was a hollow shell of a woman, but she never imagined they would go this far. Then, she did something that saved my life. She did not offer me a bed for the week. She knew that would only delay the inevitable. She walked over to her purse, pulled out 2 crisp $20 bills, and laid them flat on the table. Next to the $40, she placed a small, slightly yellowed business card. It read, Silas Woodworks and Restoration. She told me Silas was her nephew. He ran a shop 2 towns over, about a 2-hour bus ride away. She said he was a hard, quiet man who needed a shop hand, someone who would keep their head down and work until their bones ached. She told me to take the money, buy a bus ticket, and never look back at this street again. I took the $40 and the card. She gave me an old pair of sneakers and a clean, oversized t-shirt. An hour later, I was sitting on a Greyhound bus, watching the wealthy suburbs of my childhood blur into the distance. The rhythmic hum of the bus engine vibrated through the floorboards, matching the slow, steady beating of my heart. I stared out the cracked window at the passing highway, realizing that the family I had spent 25 years trying to please was completely dead to me. I had $93 in the bank, $40 in my pocket, and absolutely nothing to lose. The slate was not just wiped clean, it had been smashed to pieces, and I was holding the hammer. Silas's workshop was a cavernous, dusty warehouse sitting on the edge of a forgotten industrial park. The moment I pushed open the heavy metal door, the thick, rich smell of aged pine, sawdust, and strong chemical varnish hit me like a physical wall. The air was hazy with wood dust floating in the shafts of sunlight. Silas was a massive man with a thick beard and calloused hands that looked like they were carved from stone. He did not ask for my resume. He did not ask why I looked like I had just survived a war. He simply pointed to a massive pile of rough-cut lumber in the corner and told me to start sanding it down. If I survived the week, he said, he would let me sleep on a small cot in the storage room and pay me a meager stipend under the table. Those first few months were a special kind of physical hell. I swept endless mountains of sawdust, hauled vintage armoires that weighed more than I did, and sanded down antique bedposts until the skin on my fingertips literally peeled away, leaving raw, weeping blisters. My back ached with a constant, dull throb, and my muscles screamed every morning when I rolled off that thin, lumpy cot. But I never complained. Not once. Because the physical agony was the greatest therapy I could have ever asked for. It silenced the noise in my head. When you are forcing your entire body to push a heavy grit sandpaper over a stubborn piece of oak for 6 hours straight, you do not have the mental capacity to think about your mother's cruel laughter or your father's heavy fists. You only think about the grain of the wood. You only think about the task directly in front of you. Silas was not a talker, but he was an observer. He watched me pour every ounce of my repressed trauma into my hands. About 6 months in, he gave me my first real project. It was a massive, beautiful oak dresser that had been severely damaged in a house fire. The entire right side was charred completely black, the wood cracked and smelling heavily of smoke and ash. Most people would have thrown it in the dumpster, deeming it completely useless. But Silas told me to strip it down. For 3 weeks, I worked on that dresser. I used heavy steel scrapers to aggressively tear away the thick, black, ruined layers of wood. I scraped and sanded, coughing on the soot, digging deep beneath the trauma the wood had endured. And slowly, inch by painful inch, I found it. Beneath the horrific burns, the core of the oak was still completely intact. It was bright, strong, and incredibly resilient. I spent another week oiling it, bringing the rich, golden honey color back to life. When I finally finished, standing back to look at the gleaming piece of furniture, I broke down. It was the first time I had cried since I was locked in that iron cage. I wept because I realized I was not crying for the dresser. I was crying for myself. I was scraping away the burnt, ruined layers of the scapegoat they had created, and underneath it all, I found a core that was completely unbroken. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. I practically lived in that woodshop, breathing in the dust, learning everything Silas had to teach me. I used the small amount of money he paid me to buy a cheap, prepaid burner phone and exactly 3 sets of work clothes from a local thrift store. I started taking night classes at the community college, studying furniture design, structural engineering, and business management. I was a sponge, absorbing everything, completely laser-focused on building a foundation that could never be ripped out from under me again. By the time I turned 27, I had saved enough to move out of the storage room and rent a tiny, one-bedroom apartment above a noisy laundromat. It was small, it smelled like detergent, and the heater barely worked, but it was entirely mine. It was during this time that I made the final, definitive severing of my past. I went to the courthouse, paid the filing fee, and legally changed my entire name. I stripped away the family name they had cursed me with and became Rowan Blackwood. Blackwood, because I was shaped by the dark, heavy timber of Silas's shop, the place that had saved me. Rowan Blackwood was not a victim. Rowan Blackwood was an artist, a creator, a woman who commanded respect through the sheer force of her skill. One rainy Tuesday night, sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment eating a bowl of cheap noodles, I made a mistake. I opened a web browser and searched for Sienna's public social media account. I had not looked at it in 2 years. I told myself I was just curious, but a small, pathetic part of me still wondered if they had ever filed a missing persons report, if they ever regretted throwing me away. Her page loaded instantly. It was a curated, sickening display of manufactured wealth. Designer bags, luxury vacations, and perfectly staged photos in the house I used to haunt. I scrolled down and stopped completely cold. It was a photo of Sienna sitting on our old back patio, holding a crystal glass of champagne, laughing brightly. The caption read, "When the dead weight finally disappears, life tastes like expensive rose. Cheers to new beginnings." I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. They were not looking for me. They were openly celebrating my absence. They viewed my disappearance as a massive victory, a house cleaning that finally rid them of the embarrassing, useless daughter. The sorrow I thought I had buried erupted, but it did not turn into tears. It crystallized into something cold, hard, and terrifyingly sharp. I closed the laptop very slowly. I did not want them to love me anymore. I wanted them to choke on their own arrogance. I decided right then and there that I was not just going to survive in the shadows. I was going to build an empire so bright it would completely blind them. I was going to eclipse them in every single way. By the time I turned 29, another 2 years had passed, and my entire reality had shifted. I was no longer sweeping sawdust for Silas, though he remained my closest confidant and mentor. I had launched my own high-end custom furniture and restoration business under the name Rowan Blackwood Designs. I started small, selling reclaimed and fully restored vintage pieces on online marketplaces. But my work had a distinct, raw authenticity to it that wealthy people absolutely craved. Within 18 months, my pieces caught the eye of a prominent interior designer in the city. After that, everything exploded. I was suddenly flooded with commissions from real estate stagers, luxury hotel decorators, and ridiculously wealthy private clients who wanted bespoke dining tables and custom bed frames. I moved my operations into a massive, well-lit studio space of my own. I hired 2 assistants. I bought a reliable truck. My bank account, which once held a pathetic $93, now held a very comfortable 6-figure sum. I had built an impenetrable armor of success, wealth, and genuine respect. My clients loved me because I was mysterious. I never talked about my past, my family, or where I came from. I projected an aura of complete, unbothered confidence. I wore tailored workwear, kept my hands slightly calloused, and negotiated contracts with the cold, calculated precision of a sniper. The scared, fawning girl who used to tiptoe around the basement was completely dead. Rowan Blackwood was a force of nature. I had everything I ever wanted, and I was entirely content to live the rest of my life, never speaking to my blood relatives again. I assumed the universe had separated us forever. But fate, it turns out, has a deeply twisted sense of humor. It was a standard Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in my studio office, drinking coffee and sorting through a mountain of email inquiries. I clicked on a message from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Urgent inquiry for custom centerpiece dining table." I opened the email and began to read the overly formal, incredibly pretentious text. The sender was requesting a massive, live-edge walnut dining table for a high-profile charity gala. They needed it to be a showstopper, something that screamed authentic luxury and grit. They wanted it delivered in exactly 6 weeks. I scrolled down to the signature block, and the air completely left my lungs. The name at the bottom was Helena, my mother. She had attached a link to the event page. It was a launch party and fundraiser for Sienna's new luxury lifestyle brand. They were hosting it in the sprawling backyard of the Birchwood Drive house. Helena had absolutely no idea she was emailing the daughter she had thrown into a dog kennel. She had simply asked her wealthy interior designer friends for the name of the most exclusive, sought-after woodworker in the state, and they had handed her my name. Rowan Blackwood. I sat frozen in my leather desk chair, staring at the screen as a slow, dark smile crept across my face. The absolute, delicious irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. They were literally trying to throw their money at me to buy the creativity and skill of the child they had deemed entirely worthless. They wanted a piece of my soul to decorate their fake, plastic lives. I could have ignored it. I could have clicked delete and moved on with my successful day. But the image of Sienna's Instagram post flashed in my mind. Dead weight. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and drafted a reply. I played the part of the arrogant, highly sought-after designer perfectly. I told her I rarely took rush jobs, but I would make an exception for an event of this caliber. Then I attached the quote. I took my usual rate for a custom walnut table, which was already incredibly high, and I tripled it. I quoted her exactly $25,000. Half upfront, non-refundable. It was an extortionate, completely unreasonable number. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone pinged. It was an email from Helena. She accepted without a single blink. She even wrote that true artistry is worth any price. The $12,500 deposit hit my business account before the end of the day. They had taken the bait completely blind. For the next 6 weeks, I poured every ounce of my history, my anger, and my cold, calculated spite into that piece of walnut wood. It was a massive, stunning slab of dark timber. I worked on it late into the night, long after my assistants had gone home. I sanded the surface until it was as smooth as glass, finishing it with a deep, rich oil that made the dark grain pop with incredible intensity. To the naked eye, it was a flawless, $25,000 masterpiece of modern design. But it was a Trojan horse. On the final night, I flipped the massive table completely upside down. Taking my specialized wood-burning tool, I carefully and meticulously carved a message directly into the center of the underside. It was hidden, invisible unless you were sitting on the floor directly beneath it, but it was burned deep into the core of the wood. I carved the exact words she had used to mock me. Dead weight floats when you're made of stone. Then I took a heavy, wax-sealed envelope and used a small metal bracket to screw it directly over the engraving. Inside the envelope was a single photograph of me, my knees bloody, sitting inside the rusted iron dog kennel, with the words Rowan Blackwood written across the back. On the day of the gala, I did not go. I hired Silas and his team to deliver the piece and set it up in the center of their massive event tent. I stayed in my studio, drinking a glass of whiskey, waiting for the fallout. Silas called me that evening, his deep voice rumbling with a rare, genuine laugh. He told me he and his crew had set the table up perfectly. Helena was practically vibrating with arrogance, showing off the $25,000 centerpiece to dozens of wealthy guests in designer gowns. But then, Silas said, Sienna dropped her expensive clutch under the table. When she knelt down to retrieve it, she saw the wax-sealed envelope screwed into the wood. She ripped it off, tore it open, and looked at the photo. Then, she read the burned engraving. Silas told me Sienna let out a scream that sounded like a dying animal. The entire party stopped dead. Victor rushed over, snatched the photo from her hand, and his face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ghostly white. Helena looked at the engraving, realized that her highly publicized, incredibly expensive centerpiece was a monument to her own child abuse, and literally locked herself in the downstairs bathroom and refused to come out. Victor ended up screaming at the guests, demanding everyone leave, completely destroying Sienna's launch party in front of 50 of the most influential people in their social circle. The table had completely shattered their perfect illusion. And I had been paid $25,000 to do it. A full year passed after the incident with the table. I was 30 years old, my business was thriving beyond my wildest expectations, and I had completely forgotten about the people on Birchwood Drive. I assumed the humiliation at the gala was the end of our story. But a life built on vanity and lies is a house of cards, and a stiff breeze was finally blowing through. It was mid-November when I received a strange envelope in my business mail. There was no return address, just a cheap, crookedly sealed envelope. I opened it up and a single sheet of paper fell onto my desk. It was a printed notice from a regional bank. It was a public foreclosure listing. Right in the middle of the page, highlighted in bright yellow marker, was the address of my childhood home. I stared at the paper, the reality slowly sinking in. Over the past few months, I had heard whispers through the local design community. Sienna's lifestyle brand had been a catastrophic, humiliating failure, burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars in inventory and marketing with zero return. Desperate to maintain their wealthy facade, Victor had taken out massive second mortgages on the house and poured his retirement funds into high-risk investments that completely tanked. The money they had stolen from my college jobs, the money they had flaunted in my face, was entirely gone. They were completely bankrupt, and the bank was taking the house. The fortress where they had sacrificed me on the altar of their own ego was crumbling to dust. I sat back in my chair and looked at the foreclosure notice. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I did not feel the urge to call them or offer a lifeline. The fawning, desperate daughter was dead. The woman sitting in the designer chair was a strategist, and she was looking at a chessboard where the king was completely exposed. I realized I had the power to deliver the final, absolute checkmate. They were losing the house, yes, but I wanted to make sure they knew exactly who was taking it from them. The property was scheduled for a public bank auction in exactly 3 weeks. I had the liquid capital to buy the house outright with cash, but I knew if my name appeared anywhere on the bidder list, Victor would find a way to contest it or drag out the legal proceedings just to spite me. I needed to be entirely invisible until the trap was completely sprung. I reached out to a young couple, David and Maria. I had met them a year prior when a severe flood destroyed their tiny basement apartment. They had practically nothing, and their baby was due in a month. I had completely restored all their water-damaged furniture for free, simply because they were kind, hard-working people who needed a break. They had cried in my studio when I refused their money. Now I called them into my office and laid a massive cashier's check on the desk. I explained the situation. I did not give them the dark, bloody details, but I told them the house belonged to abusive people from my past, and I needed to buy it anonymously. I told them if they acted as my proxy buyers at the auction, not only would I pay them a generous fee for their time, but I would legally transfer the deed of the house to them once the dust settled. I was going to buy $1 million property in cash and simply give it away to complete strangers, just to ensure my family could never, ever step foot inside it again. David and Maria looked at me like I was insane, but they agreed. The day of the auction, I sat in my studio, my phone resting on the desk. At exactly 2 p.m, Maria texted me. The gavel fell. We won. It's done. The Birchwood Drive house, the prison where I was tormented, the driveway where I was dragged, the backyard where I was locked in a cage, now legally belong to me. I instructed David and Maria to handle the closing paperwork quietly and told them to wait exactly 2 weeks before moving a single box onto the property. I had one final performance to direct. I went to a local printer and ordered heavy, expensive, custom embossed cardstock. I printed 3 formal invitations that read, Open House Celebration. A new beginning for 27 Birchwood Drive. I hired a courier to hand-deliver one to Victor, one to Helena, and one to Sienna at their new, cramped rental apartment across town. I knew their psychology perfectly. I knew they would look at that invitation and desperately convince themselves that I had bought the house to save them. They would rationalize that I was finally acting like a dutiful daughter, that the open house was a surprise party to welcome them back to their rightful throne, to apologize for the humiliation of the table. On Saturday afternoon, I parked my truck down the street. out of sight. I stood behind the thick hedge near the front porch. I was not wearing designer clothes. I wore my heavy canvas work overalls, my steel-toed boots, and a plain t-shirt covered in sawdust. At exactly noon, Victor's beat-up sedan pulled into the driveway. Victor, Helena, and Sienna stepped out. They were dressed up, looking around with greedy, expectant eyes. But there was no welcome back banner. Instead, planted firmly in the center of the perfectly manicured lawn, was a large, hand-carved wooden sign I had made. It read, "This home was rebuilt with grace, not guilt." Standing on the front porch, holding their baby and smiling warmly, were David and Maria. Victor stopped dead in his tracks. Helena blinked, her face twisting in utter confusion. "Who are you?" Victor barked, his voice echoing off the brick. "You must be here for Rowan," Maria said softly, completely unfazed by his aggression. "She gave us the house. We are the new owners." I stepped out from behind the hedge, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel driveway. The three of them snapped their heads toward me. They completely froze. The arrogance melted off their faces, replaced by pure, unfiltered shock. "Why?" Victor finally choked out, his fists clenching at his sides. "You bought our house, after everything we did for you, and you just gave it to strangers? You could have saved us." "I did save someone," I said, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger or sorrow. "I gave it to a family who will never use this kitchen to scream at their child. Who will never use this driveway to drag their daughter across the concrete to prove a point." Sienna stepped forward, her face red with embarrassment. "You think this makes you better than us? You're still just a vindictive bitch." I looked at her, then looked at my parents. "No," I said quietly. "It makes me free. You threw your daughter in a dog kennel. You don't get to act shocked when she finally bites back." I walked over to Victor and handed him a small, polished wooden box. He took it automatically, his hands shaking. I turned my back on them and walked down the driveway toward my truck. I did not look back. I heard the click of the wooden box opening. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was the heavy, rusted iron padlock from the dog kennel they had locked me in 5 years ago. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove away. I never saw them or that house ever again. Am I wrong for orchestrating their final financial humiliation and giving their beloved house to complete strangers, or did they get exactly the reality check they deserved? Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you are watching this video from. See you in the next story.